Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, here we are from group 4. We would like to present the subject of Naratology presentation with the title Example of Story Analysis with Naratology Approach, the case of the genre of Roman short stories. There are 5 members of our group today. From the first is Sahnan Al-Hasan. Second, I am myself, Diella Ariel Laksono, Raihan Akram Al-Aqib, Muhammad Fathurrijal M, and Diorama Huga Fernanda. Okay, there are several themes of our discussion today. The first is Roman story level. Second is stage of story analysis with Naratology stage 1, analyzing event. The next is example of stylistic and structural theory. And the last is how to determine the important reputation of an event in the story.
The difference between narratology and story stylistics: narratology doesn't aim to assess or criticize the uniqueness of a literary work, such as novels and short stories, but rather targets the novel systems and perceptions in general. In this regard, classic students are often referred to by narratologists because of its pioneering effort to describe a storyline. Is a book published by Vladimir Prop from Russia, Morphology of the Folktale in Russian in 1928, which had just been translated into England 30 years later. In explaining narrativity, early narratologists still based themselves on the syntactic model of structuralism. That's why their study still emphasizes on one level, story. Among of the three levels of stories consisting of story, text, and narration levels. The first level is story. At this level, the question is how to determine the smallest elements of the story and build the rules of combination and permutation. Therefore, these early narratologists then proposed functional concepts to answer the problems such as functions, narrative sentence, cardinal function, catalyzer, sphere of action, and acton. In the context of the search for storytelling at the historical level, narrativity was originally understood. The next one is the text. In the Riemann-Keenan formula, the state is defined as what we read, in which the events do not have to appear in chronological order. The characteristics of the characters are scattered everywhere in it, and everything concerning the story's content is filtered through some kind of prism or perspective focalist. In other words, if a story is the result of abstraction, then the text is the source of the abstraction. Another important aspect in the text is characterization. In general, narratologists do not see characters or story characters as in individuals. Because of that, they cannot be captured directly by us, but can only be identified through the exposure of the text or drawing conclusions based on the explanation. And the third level is narration. In a story, there are events and characters that we are not automatically knowing its presence, because it's told by the narrator to the narratee, and we are here to analyze it. Therefore, we cannot see the condition of the characters and what events they experience as a neutral reality, but we can always see and present them through the narrator's perspective in the context of his communication interest with the storyteller. Ordinary readers usually tend to ignore that the communication aspects inside the internal dimension of the story itself, the level of storytelling, so that it confuses the author of the story with the narrator of the story.
Stage of story analysis with Naratology stage 1, analyzing events. Okay, let's see the first point, stylistic and structural theory. Stylistic theory aims to reveal the aesthetic uniqueness of literary work. Okay, aside from the theory which aims to reveal the uniqueness of a literary work, structural theory avoids the concept of aesthetics and is more aimed at dismantling conventions. Conventions are essential things that are essential in literature because without conventions, literary works cannot be implemented. And let's see the second point. Structural theory avoids the concept of aesthetic and is more aimed at dismantling convention, which are the system of rules that underlie certain genre in literature. Although they are contradictory concepts, uniqueness and convention in literature always exist together as the development bones of literary life itself. So, stylistic theory and structural theory are in fact two theories that support each other even though they have different goals.
So for the example of stylistic and structural theory, please read this short story below. From this story, there are 5 events. First, tokoh kaum menunggu angkot di halte sambil terkantuk-kantuk. Second, tokoh kaum melakukan itu tiap hari. Third, angkot datang. Fourth, tokoh kaum naik ke angkot. And fifth, tokoh kaum melihat dirinya masih menunggu angkot di halte sambil terkantuk-kantuk. So from this story, the stylistic theory is in the events number 5, because it has surreal in nature and surprising ending. How could you see yourself sleeping on the bus? And for the structural theory, this aspect of attractiveness is not a concern, because even if event number 5 is omitted, the short story can still be called a story. If the events in the short story continue to be cut until the first event, then the basic rules of the story are violated, and we can no longer classify them as stories.
Now, look at the example below. You can read it by yourself. At this example, we confuse whether this is a story or a poetry, because the basic principle of the story have been broken. What is being broken? The form of the story itself. It can be seen in the previous example. The story is in the form of a paragraph, while the poem is in the form of a rhyme. How to determine the important reputation of an event in the story? First, we must consider the genre of the story itself. For example, in the genre of romance, falling in love should be the main event. The writers of romance stories are always struggling about the events of falling in love, namely how to process this event as something unique and interesting. Second, we can determine the main and side events by three criteria determined by Mike Ball, one of the structural studies experts from the Netherlands. They are: change, namely events must bring potential change to the storyline, and can move to the next. Choice, namely events must open for certain options. Conflict, confrontation, namely events that are contradictory.